Our next speaker has been described as the conscience of the Congress, and with good reason. For nearly 2 decades of service representing Massachusetts' 2nd District, Jim McGovern has kept human rights on the congressional radar. On issue after issue, from repression in China to the persecution of the Rohingya in Burma to the effort to close the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay, Congressman McGovern has fought to put human rights at the heart of government policy. I first met him 25 years ago when he was a staffer for the late Congressman Joe Moakley. At the time, Jim was leading the congressional investigation into the murders in El Salvador of 6 Jesuit priests, their housekeeper, and her daughter. The investigation ultimately led to a seminal change in U.S. foreign policy towards El Salvador when it was determined that the Salvadoran military was implicated in the murders. That landmark determination led to future U.S. military aid being conditioned on human rights improvements. Congressman McGovern has continued to focus on ensuring that American taxpayers are not subsidizing human rights violations. That's why he's focused so much attention on Bahrain, where the monarchy is engaged in a multi-year crackdown on pro-democracy activists and dissent in general. Congressman McGovern has pressed the Obama administration to hold this close American ally to account and to stop sending it weapons. His leadership has not been lost on the regime in Bahrain, which last year refused to allow him into the country. Jim McGovern isn't content to sit on the sidelines and be right. He is in the trenches, crafting and passing legislation to forge progress on crucial human rights issues. And as the co-chair of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, he believes that respect for human rights is and should be a bipartisan issue. Jim's voice has been a clarion call at important moments when we as Americans need to remember who we are and what we stand for. As part of a congressional delegation that traveled to the Syrian border, he called on the U.S. government to do more to address the needs of refugees and, more recently, led the floor debate against the House bill that would effectively shut the door on both Syrian and Iraqi refugees. As he said in his floor speech, and I quote, "America is at a critical crossroads. It is moments like this that define who we are as a nation. This bill would only perpetuate the politics of fear and intolerance. Americans are better than that, and now more than ever, we must stay true to our values." Please welcome a stalwart champion of human rights and a great friend of Human Rights First, Congressman Jim McGovern.
Well, thank you, Elisa, for the very generous introduction. I can hardly wait to hear what I'm going to say after that build-up, but I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I want to thank Human Rights First for the invitation to be here today to speak about the challenges that we all face as advocates for human rights and democracy around the world. I probably should tell you at the outset, because some people think that I'm George McGovern's son, and they always tell me that they're big supporters of my father. And they always seem a little shocked when I say thank you. My father owns a liquor store in Massachusetts, and please keep on supporting him. I worked as an intern for George McGovern, even though we're not related with the same last name, but he very much has influenced my way of thinking on human rights and a lot of other issues. But it's great to be here. This dialogue is especially critical at this moment in history, as so many of those who claim the mantle of leadership are engaged in fear-mongering and urging our country to respond to despicable terrorist attacks by repeating last century's mistakes. You know, as I was thinking about this morning's forum, I looked again at the description on the agenda of the panel discussion that will begin in a few minutes, and you're going to be very impressed with the caliber of the people who are going to present to you. But I was struck not so much by what has changed, but by what has not. You know, authoritarian states waging a global ideological campaign against democracy and human rights reminds me a lot of the Cold War, as does the use of misinformation and propaganda, the political manipulation of foreign aid and multinational institutions, and fake elections. The phrasing of the question also struck me because it characterizes the problem in us-them terms. How can the United States and its allies effectively push back against this mounting international threat to human rights and democracy? That might make sense if the U.S. and our allies were always on the right side of democracy, human rights versus authoritarianism dilemma. But my experience is that it's not always the case, and I think we need to be candid about that. As Lisa pointed out, by way of giving you a little bit of my history, before I was elected to Congress in 1996, I served for 14 years as a senior aide to the late Congressman Joe Moakley from South Boston. In that capacity, I was asked to help lead a congressional investigation on behalf of a special commission appointed by the Speaker of the House and chaired by Congressman Moakley into the murders of 6 Jesuit priests, their housekeeper and daughter, committed at the University of Central America in San Salvador back in 1989. That atrocity took place in the context of the Salvadoran Civil War. And we were able to determine, as a result of that investigation, that the Salvadoran military planned and carried out the murders and then covered it up. Many of you remember that at the time El Salvador was a U.S. ally, a strong U.S. ally, combating a left-wing insurgency, and so its armed forces benefited by very large amounts of U.S. military assistance, in spite of that government's very serious and atrocious human rights record. When the war was over and the bodies were counted, more than 75,000 civilians had died, thousands more had disappeared, thousands of thousands had been tortured. To this day, accountability for the human rights violations and crimes committed during that war is elusive. But I have to tell you, all these years later, I still feel unsettled when I think about how, at the time, my government explained away and justified and even lied about these terrible atrocities. El Salvador, in many parts, reflected kind of our larger Cold War policies. We chose back then to believe that any kind of revolutionary movement was born either in Moscow or Havana, as if you could get a country to engage in revolution simply by exporting it, like you export a bale of cotton. And as a result of that, we chose to overlook human rights issues in favor of our own misguided strategic priorities. I can't help but think that how we could have better served our own interests, and certainly the interest of human rights, had we taken a different approach, had we made human rights more front and center in our policies toward El Salvador. The Cold War ended in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and for a brief time there was euphoric talk of a peace dividend, not least by President Bush and Prime Minister Thatcher. U.S. military spending decreased in the early 1990s and stayed flat for a decade, even with the Gulf War and the wars in Bosnia and Kosovo. But then came September 11th and the resulting war against terrorism. And since that fateful day, we have spent $4.4 trillion and counting on a series of wars in South Central Asia and the Middle East. Some 370,000 people have died due directly to the violence of war, of whom 210,000 were civilians. 6,800 brave U.S. soldiers and 6,900 contractors have been killed, and disability claims continue to pour into the Veterans Administration. 970,000 as of the end of March last year. In the region, 7.6 million people have been displaced indefinitely, a number equivalent to the entire population of my home state of Massachusetts plus Delaware. All this, and yet the war is unending. The newest iteration against the brutal so-called Islamic State began last year and has already intensified in the aftermath of Paris and San Bernardino. So let me be clear. Of course, the United States must combat and fight against those who would use terrorist tactics to intimidate, maim, and kill innocent people, and certainly people on our soil, whether their hate-filled extremist ideology is homegrown or comes from abroad. But we need to make sure that that fight is not used to justify human rights abuses and war crimes that end up generating even more extremism. We in the United States can't have it both ways. We cannot expect that others will respect human rights and protect civilians if we do not, nor that democracy can be built on a foundation of repression. I thought perhaps that we had learned these lessons from the Cold War, but I still worry that we haven't learned them well enough. Some of the things that have been done in our name in recent years that have contributed to undermine human rights norms and international humanitarian law are so well known that I need only mention them. The use of torture and waterboarding, Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo. We owe those who challenged these practices at the time a great deal of debt for helping to slow the train of what I believe our own destruction. And I'm not talking about people in politics. I'm talking about people within our military, people within the medical community, people who have been human rights advocates who stood up to some of these practices. But even when critics are given their due after the fact, new problems appear, such as our now reliance on drone strikes that unfortunately have ended up killing a lot of civilians. The real number of civilian deaths from drones is unknown because so little information is available. But in Pakistan in 2011 alone, the figure was between 72 and 155. For the average Pakistani on a street somewhere, a drone strike likely feels as random and indiscriminate as any mass shooting does to us. And then there are the questions of our allies. This year, in my capacity as the co-chair of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, I have heard from victims of human rights abuses committed by the governments of Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, just to name a few. Among them, these countries receive billions and billions of U.S. military aid every year as they systematically repress their own populations. I believe in engagement, and I appreciate that calculating the balance between national security and other objectives is complex. But these are countries where doctors have been imprisoned for treating injured protesters, where the death of their husbands can leave women stateless, and where tens of thousands of people have been jailed for dissent. At the end of the day, I think we should not be surprised that many people who live in the Middle East or elsewhere do not necessarily always perceive the United States to be the great protector of human rights. In short, what I want to say to you is that when we reflect on the question on how the U.S. and its allies can strengthen human rights and democracy in today's world, we must first always seek to continually narrow the gap between what we value and the way we conduct ourselves on the world stage, including in the context, and especially in the context, of armed conflicts. We must act in accordance with our commitment to human rights, not only when it is convenient, but especially when it is hard. Now, I believe in diplomacy and engagement, and I always believe in holding governments, including our own, accountable for the way they treat their people. Sometimes foreign policy experts and some in our own government act as if engagement and accountability are always at odds with each other. But as I look around the world, I see human rights abuses contributing to prolonged wars and generate violent extremism and encouraging instability. I believe our only option is engagement with accountability. First, as we engage governments around the world, we must continue to prioritize our relationships with civil society as well, providing both political and financial support. The U.S. has a strong record of support for civil society that must be sustained. We should be backing the efforts of human rights organizations to hold their governments accountable. We should be supporting the peacemakers who work on reconciliation, strengthen resilient communities, and seek to create tolerance, community, and consensus, who offer alternatives to unending war. We should be empowering women. In countries where governments are cracking down on civil society organizations, we should redouble our efforts, and our engagement should be as public and visible as possible at any given moment, because no country changes without pressure from its citizenry, and democracy does not function without civil society. At the same time, we should also remember that we don't have a corner on the market of what constitutes and defines democracy. It can take many forms, just like freedom. It is best defined by the dreams and aspirations of those in society who are most deprived of its benefits. This is why all democracies, including our own, are a work in progress. Second, U.S. administrations must not shy away from raising human rights and democracy issues with any government, no matter how big. I just returned from a congressional trip to China and Tibet, during which all of us as members of Congress took every opportunity to talk about human rights issues. We were respectful, but we did not back down from expressing our concerns about the treatment of the Tibetan population, or our rejection of the jailing of opposition activists, lawyers, and religious figures. Now, I don't expect that our week of dialogue will magically transform Chinese policies, but we tried to make the point that while Chinese officials view any opposition, any religion, or any free thinking as a threat to their stability, in reality, the Chinese government's policy of jailing and silencing those who fall into these categories actually makes China's future less stable. We have to try to convince them that inclusion is the key for long-term stability. At the same time, let's not repeat the great mistakes of the Cold War and cleave human rights into ideological pieces. I believe in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in its entirety. I believe it is one body of rights. Ending hunger is equally as important as freedom of religion. Freedom of expression is equally as important as health care. Each and all of our basic human rights as necessary as oxygen to a life with dignity. Third, we should continue to strengthen the tools we have available to pursue accountability, both judicial and non-judicial. Last January, Congressman Chris Smith of New Jersey and I introduced the Global Magnitsky Act, which would allow the President to impose sanctions on any foreign person determined to be responsible for committing gross violations of human rights against individuals who try to expose illegal activity by government authorities or who are otherwise exercising, defending, or promoting internationally recognized human rights. These people would not be able to enter the United States nor engage in property transactions here if, in fact, they were found to qualify for these sanctions. This legislation, however, is not a substitute for strengthening the rule of law in countries where human rights violations and corruption happen every day and undermine democracy and security. But it would give this and future administrations a powerful tool at the international level to try to ensure that people responsible for abuses and crimes do not completely get away with them, that there is a consequence to bad behavior. At a minimum, perpetrators should not benefit from being able to come to this country and to do business here. And your support for passage of this bill would be most welcome. As we seek to strengthen accountability for human rights violators, we must also embrace the need for accountability for violations of international humanitarian law. We should find ways to support and strengthen the documentation of war crimes, and we should make sure that the sanctions framework extend to these crimes. The International Criminal Court was a major step forward, but it is only as effective as the will of the international community to enforce its decisions. We should be encouraging initiatives that can facilitate and complement the court's work. And I, for one, deeply regret that President George W. Bush removed the U.S. from the Treaty of Rome and its important work. At the same time, we must renew our commitment and our allies to the protection of civilians in conflict. In the case of Syria, for example, there are some very specific things we can do, such as hardening medical facilities and encouraging the opening of more border crossing points to facilitate the flow of aid. And what we should not be doing is what Congress in the House did a couple of weeks ago and turn our backs based on paranoia and fear on some of the most vulnerable people in the world. And I hope that as time goes on and as people realize the exhaustive process that people go through to become refugees in this country, that we will get Congress to do the right thing. We should also reinforce the implementation of the Leahy Law and continue to condition military aid to countries with egregious human rights records, especially in situations of armed conflict. We know that this sort of pressure can make a difference. And at this juncture, the United States simply cannot afford to be complicit in human rights or humanitarian law abuses committed by other governments. A new cause for worry is the current Saudi campaign in Yemen, supported by the U.S., which is killing 30 people a day, has displaced 1.4 million, and is destroying civilian infrastructure, including medical facilities. Not only is the war not resolving the underlying political problem, but once again, the total disregard for civilians is deepening secular divisions. We should not be surprised if this comes back to haunt. Finally, the U.S. must debate a new authorization for the use of military force. After 14 years of the war against terrorism, with no end in sight, the most important thing we can do is have a serious debate over U.S. strategy and tactics, in which the voices of those who understand the negative consequences of our current approach including its impact on international human rights and humanitarian law, can be heard. At the end of the day, I'm an optimist, and I believe reasoned debate is possible, and I believe reason and rational debate on issues like war are essential. Sometimes debates actually clarify policy. Sometimes we learn from debates. Sometimes we change our mind based on debates. But what is unacceptable is for that building behind us to be silent on this issue. War is a big deal. It is a big deal for the men and women who serve our country. It is a big deal for the civilians who oftentimes become victims in these wars. It is a big deal because of all the resources that are invested. It is something that we have to talk about, and Congress needs to do its job. So what I've talked to you about today is not by any means an exhaustive list. But to conclude, I just want to insist on one simple idea. Any failure on our part to comply with our obligations under international law ends up weakening the very norms and standards we want other countries to live by. So the first place we should be looking as we think about how to strengthen human rights and democracy in the world is in our own backyard. Talking about human rights, standing up for human rights is not always convenient. It is easy in a cocktail party to say we all care about human rights. It is easy oftentimes when we're in conversation at conferences to say we all care about human rights. The world is messy. It is not always easy, but quite frankly, we have a moral obligation to do that. And I think we can do better, and to the extent we can do better, that we can lead the rest of the world, and I think that would be a good thing in terms of creating a better, more tolerant and less violent world. So thank you very much for having me here today.